Greetings, greetings, greetings. Welcome to So Much to Talk About. My name is Nabaté Isles, and it's always a pleasure to share facts and viewpoints on the world of sports, society, and music. This week is no different, and I have another tremendous guest on my show. Before I introduce this wonderful gentleman, I would like to remind all of you to go to my YouTube page, which is N as in No, S as in Sam, I as in Indigo, NSI World, to check out past episodes of So Much to Talk About, where you can check out past interviews and episodes in general of me talking about the world of sports and music and society, et cetera, et cetera. So, but this episode, it will definitely be on YouTube. And I have a pleasure of having a gentleman who is one of the great sports minds, one of the great authors. And I want to tell you all about him. And he has a vast career as an educator, professor, coach, athletic director, and author. He has taught at Loyola and DePaul Universities in Chicago. He was the athletic director at North Park University, where they won the NCAA Division III Men's Basketball Championship in 1987. He has authored compelling books on education with Black and brown children. Also, too, his experiences dealing with colleges recruiting his highly touted son in football. Also, he wrote a great book on advanced NBA stats and also about legendary sports figures such as Bart Starr, Leo Durocher, and the latest on the unique Michigan State legendary Coach Duffy Daugherty. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce this gentleman who was set up by my good friend Rochelle Claerbaut, who is his daughter. And this gentleman, pleasure to introduce him. His name is Dr. David Claerbaut. Pleasure to have you on So Much to Talk About. How are you, sir?
Well, it's a joy to meet you. I've heard all kinds of wonderful things about you, Nabaté, so I'm very excited to join you today.
Oh, pleasure's all mine. Pleasure's all mine. And shout out to Rochelle for introducing us. And Rochelle told me so much about you, and I did the research on you. And wow, what a fascinating life, and what you've contributed to society and sports has been incredible. But how are you and your family doing with this pandemic? I always ask my guests this to see how you've been able to handle this situation, because everyone's world has changed. Everyone's lifestyle has changed. How has your lifestyle changed, and how have you been able to kind of be reflective during this time?
We are all been doing fine. We've been blessed with good health. I currently teach doctoral students at Grand Canyon University, and I am flown into Phoenix because a lot of it's online. I'm flown into Phoenix quite frequently for a week face-to-face, and we have had no problems with even any students there in those residency programs. So God is good, and we've been healthy.
There's so much to talk about, the name of the show, of course. And but I wanted to ask you about education athletics. Student athletes have, their lives have been changed by the discipline, by the diligence, by the time management, by the problem solving. Their lives have been changed for them to be better individuals. And it's been a major bond. And talk about the values, because you're involved actively in both throughout your life. And, what are the values that you've shared to inspire the youth in being their best selves in society throughout your years?
Probably one of the most interesting things about sports. And when I grew up, I always thought that was just Boy Scout talk. Sports had value because I kind of put sports in the fun category, Nabaté, and education in the not so fun category. Mm-hmm. But you really do not know how to deal with failure and adversity as any better than you will in sports. Even if you have a very successful team, they are going to lose a big game here or there. They are going to wipe out in a tournament now and then. Somebody is going to get injured. These are not things you learn in English 101. They're not the things you learn in Psych 101. I think dealing with the persistence of life in the face of challenge is the single most important value in sports.
Yes, yes, that's what it is, and it goes, it has you go deep inside yourself, for sure, and really delve into the depths. Like my good friend Teddy Atlas said, the great boxing trainer and analyst, he says you go into the dark places, and it really
Yes.
shows if you can be able to get out, for sure.
Yeah,
Wow.
and when you lose a game, even as a coach, you just other people in your life can't appreciate how painful that is.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
remember one time, one of the high school teams I coached, we lost a game on my wife's birthday, which is not a good night to lose a game. And so and for her, even though she rooted fearlessly for me, she's not into sports, of course, as I am or as you would be. So it's hard for her to understand that I didn't have that elation I ordinarily would have on her birthday because there was this overhang of that loss. And that's like something unless you flunk a class, you don't get that kind of experience in education.
That's deep. And talk about like the education, what's going on in education now, especially with COVID-19, and how there are a lot of kids that are being left behind. That, of course, as we all know, the disparity in communities on how, education has, what's been going on with certain affluent areas, and then certain areas in the city, and certain areas where you have a certain demographic, of black children, and then, like that, like, talk about like how has this COVID-19 pandemic really exposed those problems, and how can these problems be can be remedied now with, with schools starting to open gradually again.
If you look at what's called a sociology of education, which was my academic background,
Mm-hmm.
the strongest correlate with school achievement is social class. It's not even race. Middle
Mm-hmm.
class black children do better than lower class white children do. But what's interesting here is that the pandemic, of course, is just lethal for low income people because
Mm-hmm.
they are not equipped at home to supplement the education that their children need because of COVID. One study that was done some years ago, and it's something my daughter brought to my attention. It comes out of Malcolm Gladwell's writing. We talked
Oh,
about why
yes.
he said,
Mm-hmm.
why do these kids, some kids do so much better over periods of time in math? Said when you take a look at what happens during the school year when they're in class, the children might be fairly parallel in terms of how much they're learning. But in the summertime, the middle class parent is reinforcing what went on at home, taking them on trips and then showing them things that they can use that can connect to their education and math and in culture and all these kind of things. And the lower class child simply goes on sabbatical for 3 months. He comes back further behind than he was at the end of the previous school year. And if you then multiply that in a body over a series of years, your gap really starts developing. Now, when you don't have that teacher in a classroom who is skilled enough to be able to communicate this information face to face, it is really high risk business.
Wow, that's deep. Here with Dr. David Claerbaut on So Much to Talk About. Great educator, author, professor, true Renaissance man for sure. Pleasure to have him on So Much to Talk About. So, Dr. Claerbaut, want to go into your writing, and the books that you've written throughout your illustrious career and everything. Now, your latest book is on the great Duffy Daugherty, who was a great coach for the Michigan State University in the 1950s and 60s. He was the head coach for Michigan State when they faced Notre Dame they had a 10-10 tie in the quote unquote game of the century. And your book, which I want to plug for sure, Duffy Daugherty, A Man Ahead of His Time. So people, please go on Amazon to make sure that you purchase that wonderful book for sure. And sir, it's so funny. I spoke with Steve Garvey on my podcast, Where They At, and Steve Garvey was part of that Michigan State football team, but he ended up being simulating Terry Hanratty, who was the quarterback for Notre Dame in practices, helping them prepare for Notre Dame. Of course, they had the 10-10 tie. So, but talk about how Duffy Daugherty was a man ahead of his time and how people need to know how significant he was.
Duffy Daugherty, amazingly enough, in 1956, Nabaté was on the cover of Time magazine.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are people who are world famous. They'll never get their coming out of the United States. They'll never be in a cover of Time magazine. So it gives you an idea how big he was. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and the reason he was so popular is that he was almost a stand-up comedian. Whenever he went to Notre Dame, they played. The Notre Dame booster club would want Duffy to speak to them the night before because Duffy was almost like a latter-day Johnny Carson, and he was hilariously funny. And so he was just a great, especially in an era where you didn't have cable TV and all the other kinds of things. He was the greatest of all interviews you could possibly have. But of course, he was an extremely capable coach. What put him ahead of his time was that Duffy was the first, really the first coach who really aggressively recruited black players from the South. At that time, most of the Southern universities were totally segregated.
Mm-hmm.
Bear Bryant, for example, I think appealed a couple of times to Alabama to let him recruit some black players. The answer was no. So
Wow.
what happened is guys like Bear Bryant were turning Duffy Daugherty on to where the black athletes were in the South. Hey, you ought to look at this guy, Duffy. And along comes a guy like Bubba Smith,
Yes.
George Webster. All those guys came out of the South. And of course, what really happened is that he then brought in Jimmy Ray, who was a quarterback, and he was the first African American quarterback that anybody could really remember at a major school, and he was at Michigan State. Michigan State had over half their team, the starting lineups, I believe, were black, in an area where most of the teams in the Big Ten might have one or two black players in the whole squad.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow, that's amazing about Coach Daugherty. That's the thing. Like, and speaking of Bubba Smith, like I knew about Bubba Smith from Police Academy. That was my favorite, one of my favorite movies coming up. And then, of course, as I did my research, as I got older, like in middle school, I was like, wow, he was the first pick in the NFL draft. What, 1960? Oh my God, like so it's very interesting. But like you said, that's being able to integrate, so important, and that was the key of Coach Daugherty for sure. And Steve Garvey talked about Coach Daugherty highly with that sense of humor and everything like that. And of course, as we all know, Steve Garvey became, one of the great first basemen of the 1970s and should be in the Hall of Fame, for sure. So
nobody wanted ever to be with Duffy at a speech because they would just look bad compared to Duffy. Like Duffy might take some guy like Steve Garvey with him or something. And, they almost didn't want to go for fear that you have to follow Duffy, The thing also about Duffy, what makes the book a fun book for even people who never heard of Duffy Daugherty, say, I'm not interested in that. And I understand that.
uh-huh.
But I think if you start reading the first chapter and you start laughing a lot, you'll start knowing where we're going with this.
Mm-hmm.
He had just great teams at Michigan State. So you get the story of an era of a dominant program. Then you have the racial element, which becomes explosive in the 1960s.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then you have Duffy's personality through the whole thing. And again, it ended badly for Duffy because what happened is the school started cutting back on funding athletic programs. And little by little, it took the lifeblood out of the program. And Duffy basically finished his career a somewhat embittered man because the school wasn't there for him, when he needed them to be.
That's deep. And then the school like had a resurrection, the athletics in general, when a gentleman named Irvin Magic Johnson decided to stay in Lansing, Michigan, and then too bad Duffy Daugherty wasn't able to stay there to see the fruits of that resurgence, right?
That's correct. And what's interesting about this is that Magic came there about 7 years after Duffy left. That's not that long a span.
That's right.
Okay. And then, of course, after that, you have the Izzo era. The interesting thing for folks who are listening is Michigan State is located in Lansing, Michigan. I can describe Lansing, Michigan in one sentence. The train goes right through the middle of town.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not talking about like, around the edges or an Amtrak. I'm saying you better stop because the train might be going through the middle of town. It's a blue collar town. And of course, they are contrasted with the University of Michigan, which is in Ann Arbor, which is in a very elite suburb outside of Detroit. So we got a whole two different cultures there. So here's this grungy Lansing, Michigan school, pounding Michigan in football. And that's why even today there's that tremendous Michigan State rivalry, because it's not just two schools from the same state; it's two different cultures. So Nabaté, two very different cultures.
That's deep. Wow. And Michigan State, shout out to Rodney Whitaker, the great bass professor, runs a great jazz program over there now, for sure,
Okay.
the music. So
one of the fun stories is that when I wrote the book about Duffy Daugherty, I went to Michigan State University and spoke at a number of events to promote the book. And one morning I was supposed to appear on a show downtown in Lansing. And I couldn't find the place. I knew I was close by with the navigation and all that. And my wife was saying, turn left here and turn right there. So I finally gave up and I got out of my car and I went into one of those little coffee places where the people are standing in line getting coffee, and one of the guys says, hold it. And he walks out of the building in zero weather and says, okay, and you go down that street, turn left, and it'll be the second building. And that man's name was Tom Izzo.
Oh!
Wow. That tells you what kind of city it is, what kind of guy Izzo is. He was not big time Tom Izzo. He was only concerned that he could help me find that building.
Wow. He's such a gracious person. I've had the honor to cover a couple of his games. The last one was at the NCAA tournament in 2019. It was when Michigan State defeated LSU, and then they went on to defeat Duke to go to the Final Four in 2019. And Tom Izzo too. One of my favorite quotes of all time. As an educator, I use this quote: "Learn to listen, listen to learn." I mean, it's right there. And for any age,
He was the kind of guy that he was on his. I said, I'd like to give you a book later today. He said, come on by about 1:30. So I went to the Breslin Center with my wife at 1:30. This is media day. He has really no time for me. I go in at 1:30 and they tell me to wait. He comes out 10 minutes later. And he's apologizing for his being late. I mean, I'm the one asking to meet with him, but he's saying, well, I'm terribly sorry I had you wait for 10 minutes. And then he takes the book and he has a bunch of pictures taken with my wife and I. It was just a wonderful experience. He really is quite a person.
Yes, indeed. Coach Sigil, of course, Nation Basketball Hall of Famer, much deserved for sure. And wow, here with Dr. David Claerbaut on So Much to Talk About, author, professor, educator, also coach. He's coached as well, also former athletic director too. So here on So Much to Talk About, such an honor to have him on. Thank you to Rochelle, his daughter, for coordinating us to finally meet and speak. So Dr. Claerbaut, the Chicago Cubs, you wrote a book about the Cubs. And it was funny. I had John Hirschbeck, the former umpire, Major League umpire, on the show on So Much to Talk About a couple of months ago. And his last games, the last games that he umpired was the 2016 World Series. I mean, that's a great way to close your career as an umpire. And the Chicago Cubs finally won their first world championship in 108 years. Dr. Claerbaut, you're a Cubs fan, you're a lifelong Cubs fan, right? Like you've enjoyed the Cubs and everything, and you've, observed the history. How meaningful was that event of the Cubs winning the World Series, and how, was that probably the greatest event of the 21st century with the Cubs finally doing it? And the way and how great the World Series was, how it was just like your heart would be pumping if you're a Cub or Indian fan.
It's interesting you mentioned Cleveland, because they were right behind the Cubs in terms of this futility.
1948.
They did to some extent, but they didn't have the series of near misses the Cubs had from the 60s on. What made the Cubs story so unique is they just barely missed out. 1969, of course, was the ultimate heartbreak for anybody. I was getting out of college at that time, and so I can remember it firsthand. The agony of watching the whole season collapse in a matter of 10 days. And then, of course, a few years later, they win the division, but they go nowhere. They get knocked out with that error at first base with
Leon Durham. Leon 84.
Then we get the Steve Bartman experience a few years later. It was just one. It just almost seemed like it was a divine providence that the Cubs are going to be snookered out of this thing one way or the other. So people became almost expecting bad things to happen.
Ooh, wow.
And it almost happened in 2016 when that 3-run homer, I believe it was, tied the game in extra innings. And he thought, here we go for yet another time. But there were a lot of people who literally said, I just hope before I die, they do finally win. And they did. And if you remember in 1984, when they had a 5-game divisional series with the Padres and Steve Garvey, by the way, they're up 2-0.
That's right. That's right.
It was never, ever safe for the Cubs.
That's right. And Garvey was the MVP of that series. Yeah, that 84 championship series. Yeah.
Yes, and people forget that the Bartman game was not the final game of that series, the 6th game. If they won the 6th game, they win. If they don't, they come back to win the 7th game. But almost nobody. It was almost like that catastrophe in Boston in the 6th game when Buckner got the ball went through his legs. And I knew Buckler. I knew him personally because I did a lot of distribution work with some ball players, and he was just a great guy. It couldn't have happened to a guy you'd less like to see it happen to. But I'm telling you that those games, that 7th game, people just give up. They knew they were going to lose the 7th game.
Wow. And that's amazing when you mentioned about Bill Buckner, God rest his soul, very underrated player. And I'm a Met fan. So I was 9 years old when that happened. And I was elated for sure because I grew up 20 minutes from Shea Stadium in Queens and everything. But with Buckner, I felt that he got a bum rap. He should have not been. First of all, the bullpen blew it. They had 2 strikes, 3 straight hitters, 5. They were leading 5-3, 2 outs, 2 strikes, 3 straight hitters. The Mets were just gamers. So really the bullpen should have been blamed. And also they should have had Stapleton out there instead of Buckner. But John McNamara wanted Buckner to experience winning and celebrate on the field. But I'm sorry, you can't be sentimental, can't be emotional. You got to think strategically. It would have been different if he had Stapleton in first base.
And in fairness, he was not a butcher at first base. He was a very adequate first baseman. He just didn't have a lot of range because of his leg.
And bad knees, the bad knees. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. And the ankle. I think it was ankle the problem with him. But the interesting thing, you're mentioning a whole lot of things here, like it's so much to talk about. You got a good name for a show. You hit a lot of notes on the piano there. One thing people forget is this: in that event in Chicago with Bartman, people forget that. I can't remember the shortstop's name, but he bobbled a routine ground ball just before that. If he turns that I think it was a double play, they're out of it. They're done. I mean, there were a series of problems before that ball ever went to the stands. And by the way, Nabaté, could you think you or I would not have tried to get that ball if it fouled into the stands? Blaming a guy who's a fan for just reaching up and trying to catch a ball, a souvenir?
Yeah, Moises Alou.
Chicago at its worst.
Moises Alou. Yeah, and that was the thing. I think his reaction, he overreacted. And it's like, you got to be even keeled. You have to be, you should have not reacted like that. Just because that also increased the mood. It was his reaction that kind of made that mood happen. So, and Dusty Baker, poor Dusty Baker, with that Cubs team and then the Giants in 2002 having a 5-0 lead in the 8th inning. Oh, wow. Like that's, what did think of Dusty Baker? Like, how underrated is he as a manager? Everywhere he's gone, he's won.
When you talk about the issue of race in sports, it's really hard to justify the number of times Baker got let go after maybe winning a divisional title.
Right.
I think it happened twice. I think it happened in Cincinnati, and then again it happened a little bit later.
Washington, the Nats, Washington Nationals.
And the same thing. I can't remember a white manager being let go under those conditions. The only one I can remember is Grady Little. Remember when he didn't?
03, when he didn't. Yep, Pedro, he kept him in.
And much as I love sabermetrics, Nabaté, I would support Little. Hey, if I was his manager, I went to the mound, and Pedro Martinez is probably one of the 5 greatest pitchers of his era. Tells me I can get this guy out. Am I going to take him out for some, for some journeyman relief pitcher?
Right.
I understand all the numbers said what the numbers were, but I still got Pedro Martinez, and he's got some adrenaline now. But that's how cruel the game can be. It can break your heart, as they say.
Oh, very much so. Very much. It can break your heart. Wow. And now, Dr. Claerbaut, you also wrote a book about the St. Louis Cardinals. And the Cardinals, their rich history, no one talks about. People, of course, talk about the New York Yankees, talk about the Los Angeles Dodgers, who were, of course, the Brooklyn Dodgers. Sociologist before. Talk about the San Francisco Giants, who were the New York Giants before. I mean, these teams get more love than the Cardinals, but the Cardinals, they have rich history. You know, we talked about it before we went on air, but talk about like the players they've had pitching as well as hitters. That, I mean, what a great history, and why did it get overlooked?
I think that if they were not located in the Midwest, or if they were located at least in a city the size of Chicago, things might be different. But you're absolutely right. You got people like Leo Durocher and a Gas House Gang, Dizzy Dean. Then you go into the era of Stan Musial. Then you go into the era of Pujols. And if you look at the number of championships they've won in the National League, they're comparable, or they're right there with the Dodgers or anybody else. And yet, as you said, they don't get even a tenth of the attention. When I did the book, I think it was called Cardinals Confidential. I believe that's what it was.
Yes.
I had to research them from scratch. I mean, as I grew up, I knew who music was and all that kind of stuff, but I was just overwhelmed by what a tremendous tradition he had. And you can't get a seat in St. Louis. That city is so sold out on baseball, they can't keep an NBA franchise. They've lost 2 NFL franchises because the people in St. Louis are all in on the baseball Cardinals.
And it was such a pleasure for me to go to the old Busch Stadium in the mid-2000s before they went to the new one. It was such an honor to be there and everything. And then also the rich history. You have, of course, Bob Gibson, of course, Lou Brock, Curt Flood, what he meant to free agency and to giving the black athlete that push of being outspoken, Curt Flood and then, Bill White, so underrated, great announcer, great commentator, but also great first baseman too,
And one-time president of the National League.
That's right. Absolutely. That's right. In the 80s. Yes. Mid 80s. Yes, sir. So, wow. Here with Dr. David Claerbaut on So Much to Talk About here. Such an honor to talk with you about history. I mean, it's important to know history. And that's why I emphasize to my students, since you're in education, I emphasize that history, if you don't know what the past is all about, if you can't look back, then you can't look forward. Walter Payton. Oh my God. Now, Sweetness, like no one really talks about him anymore when you think about it. This man, I think he may have been the most valuable running back to his team in the history of the game. And that's including Jim Brown, because Jim Brown had great talent around him in with those Cleveland Brown teams. But Walter Payton, there were teams that were teams that he led them, he carried them. Talk about the true greatness of Sweetness.
It's interesting you mentioned Jim Brown. Jim Brown was probably as good a running back as ever lived.
Yeah, right.
But the interesting thing is he did not block. He did not catch passes, and that's okay. He did enough. I mean, he had to take some plays off, so to speak. But Walter Payton, one game, even played quarterback when the Bears lost all their quarterbacks.
Yep.
And the other thing is, like Jim Brown, he was never injured. Now, don't tell me he wasn't injured. I'll just say he never missed games.
Yeah,
this
guy
was not into load management, I'll tell you that. He played every single game.
Yes.
And as did Jim Brown. And you consider the number of hits he took and everything else. It's just astonishing. And he didn't have a drop off in his rushing numbers until something like 1985 or 86.
Right.
Usually running backs, when they hit 30, 31, they step off the curb is a term they use. They drop suddenly in production. There's some exceptions. Certainly Adrian Peterson would be an exception, but that's what they are. They're exceptions. Most of them have a big drop off. Walter continued to run up those numbers. And again, another thing about it, he was not on great teams. It wasn't as if they could surprise somebody by handing the ball off. Walter Payton was to the Bears what Aaron Rodgers is Green Bay. If you stop Walter, you stop the Bears.
Yes.
But people didn't stop him.
That's right. And that's what makes him special. And also, of course, the Walter Payton Man of the Year award. To me, if I was a professional football player, I would aspire to win that award more than the MVP. Personally, and how it's named after him. It's really deep. He was so amazing of an individual.
He was, and you'll never hear a single person say a negative thing whoever played with him or played against him.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. One of those guys is still looking to make his first enemy, in life. And extremely fan friendly from everything I know.
Mm-hmm.
Fan friendly. There was just he was just a remarkable person, but again, he did not have that personal charisma. Even Jim Brown with that kind of glowering face,
Yep.
it's something magnetic about that guy. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
Walter lacked that.
He became a movie
Didn't have
star,
that
Jim Brown. Because
charisma. Didn't have the charisma. He was living totally on his performance. But what a performance he had for a long time.
That's right. I mean, that 77 season, greatest season for any running back in the history of the game. No question. Like going back to what you said about carrying that team, that Bears team that had it carried them to the playoffs, like just where they had nothing, and as a Chicago person, you've been in Chicago throughout like your adult life, basically, and everything. And the city of Chicago, the spirit of that city, how it's called the Windy City. You have the winters that are just mucho frio, to say the least, and then you have the summers that are beautiful. But Chicago, it's organic. It has that organic vibe, the authenticity. Talk more about that as someone that, you've taught in all neighborhoods in Chicago and you've studied there and everything. Talk about that more.
If you look at Chicago and you look at Brooklyn with the Dodgers,
Mm-hmm.
you look at St. Louis, you're looking at places where people actually were born and spent their whole lives there. It's not like Los Angeles or even New York City where you have transit. People say, oh, I'm really into the 49ers. Well, you're into the 49ers because you moved to the Bay Area 2 years ago and there's nobody else you could root for, maybe other than the Raiders.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to Chicago, you're going back generations, fathers and mothers and grandparents and so forth. And they go down through the generations, and so it becomes almost a part of the DNA of the families. The Bears. I take another thing, Nabaté. You notice, man, you obviously are really well versed beyond your age, but Nabaté, in Chicago, there's no such thing as a Cub and a White Sox fan. You're either a Cub fan or a White Sox fan.
That's right. That's right.
You don't see that in other towns. They may have favor one or the other, but there's this Hatfield McCoy thing, and that's because these families are lifelong Cub fans or lifelong White Sox fans, and then lifelong Bears. And so the level of passion that's potential, latent, right under the surface at any time, is ready to explode anytime one of those teams really takes off.
Wow. It's amazing. And wanted to ask you about the current White Sox and everything, it's interesting. Tony La Russa is back with the White Sox. Of course, he led them, I think, in the 83 season to a division title, but he's back with the White Sox and this team is loaded. Now, respect to Tony La Russa, Hall of Fame manager, but that situation with the DUI and everything, and then talking about how, do you know who I am? That type of entitlement, that kind of rubbed me the wrong way. But I have to say about Mr. La Russa, who is a major jazz fan, because he's good friends with my good friend Christian McBride. So I give him that. But do you think he was cherry picking with this White Sox team? Because they are loaded with young talent, and this team could be not just American League champs this year, but they can be great for the next few years. Like, do you think he, all of a sudden he wants to manage again with this team particularly? How great can the White Sox be?
The interesting thing about La Russa is this, and this has been my experience, Nabaté. If you talk to 100 baseball fans, 95 of them will tell you they don't like La Russa. There's something about Tony La Russa that repels people. I don't know what it is. I got a pretty good idea. One thing about Tony, and I met him, I've dealt with him a few times because I did some psychological counseling with baseball players. Tony takes himself very seriously. Notice that DUI. Instead of being humble, do you know who I am? See, that's kind of thing that you're going to get. And people pick that up from him. And that's why I think in general, because I'll reverse the question about how many people do you know are baseball fans who like Tony La Russa?
Only A's fans, basically.
Okay. Yeah, I can see it there. And then that's kind of an aristocratic kind of culture. But think about guys like Whitey Herzog. Almost everybody liked Whitey Herzog.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. So, but
And Joe
getting back
Torre
to why
too.
he
People
came
love
back,
Joe Torre.
I think
Yeah.
for Tony, a big factor is this. It was where an unfinished job. He basically got fired in 1986 by Hawk Harrelson, who knew nothing about baseball, and then spent his whole career announcing without knowing anything about baseball. Because they would ask him a sabermetric question, he dismissed sabermetrics. If you dismiss sabermetrics, you may as well dismiss the multiplication tables in math.
Yep.
Because that's, if you don't know the sabermetrics, you just don't understand the science of baseball. But that's another story for another time. But La Russa got fired by Harrelson, and I think in a lot of ways for Tony, and I don't know him that well because he's hard kind of guy to get past the exterior. I got a hunch that his pride was hurt badly enough that this is his last chance to close the loop and everything. He won in Oakland, he won in St. Louis. Now he goes back to Chicago at 76, and he wins there.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And what do you think about this White Sox team coming up? I mean, the young talent they have. I mean, Tim Anderson, their star shortstop, and one of the few black stars in the game, which, we hopefully we can get more black kids to be inspired by the black stars that are coming up, like Tim Anderson and everything. He said, F it, we're the best team in the American League. Like, are they the best team in the American League?
They are really terrific. I mean, you look at the talent, just explosive of talent. And, if I look at it from Jerry Reindorf's point of view, well, Jerry's 80 years old. He wants to win.
A Brooklyn guy okay. Too, New York.
So now I'm Reinsdorf, and I say to myself, okay, if I get La Russa, who's won a bunch of championships before, I know I have a guy who's competent to lead a team that is the best team in its division. So I don't think in that respect, from a raw baseball standpoint, it's a bad hire.
Yeah, and it's a shame that Renteria got fired, and he basically, that once again, the Buck Showalter factor. You know what I mean?
Same thing happened to him in the north side. He gets fired because Joe Madden's available, not because he did a good job. In fact, if you recall, Theo Epstein was very classy. He said he does not get fired except that we're in a spot where we can get Joe Madden.
True that. And then
now it happens again. I was surprised he got fired.
Yeah, I was shocked about that too, definitely. And you don't, it's so funny. Do you think a manager or a coach wants to have that reputation that, they can build a team, but you can build a team and make the team look good for someone else to take over? Because there are managers or coaches that have that rep. I mean, is that a bad rep, or can that be a good rep? Can someone be content on saying that, hey, I built the culture of this team?
You got to be one of the only guys I've ever talked to who are onto that. Yes, some guys get that rep. Doug Collins got that rep with the Bulls.
That's right.
You can get it from A to B, but we want to get from B to C, called championship, and they do see it in the NFL all the time. A coach gets let go after a playoff year, and you say, how is it possible? And you hear, well, we want to get the C. You can get that rep. I mean, it's better than being a loser, but it's not much better, because I don't think anybody who coaches or plays does not want to win a championship, and it's really almost unfair. Because how can you say that Renteria can't do it when you didn't give him a chance to do it? And he did get his team in the playoffs last year.
Exactly. And it's in such like weird circumstances, of this weird season, for sure. Wow. Here with Dr. David Claerbaut, great author, professor, educator, coach, athletic director. He's done so much here on So Much to Talk About. Pleasure to have him on, and thanks to his daughter, Rochelle, who's one of my good friends, great attorney, music supervisor as well. Thank her for linking us and everything. And it was so funny. In talking to Rochelle, we were talking about how Cubs and White Sox fans is split up. There's no fans of both. Rochelle's probably the only one that's a fan of both those teams, right?
No matter how much she accomplishes in a movie world or as an attorney, she'll always be best known for liking the Cubs and the White Sox at the same time. That's the ultimate uniqueness.
Yes, indeed. Wow. And wanted to ask you this question. I asked Kevin Harlan this question on So Much to Talk About. Kevin Harlan, like my favorite play-by-play man, like in sports for sure. And what a great individual. And he grew, he's a Packer fan because his father was the CEO for the Packers for many years. Now it's interesting. Bart Starr, because you wrote a book about Bart Starr, and it's funny that Bart Starr's time in Wisconsin was the time that you were growing up in Wisconsin during
Yes.
that time. But you have Bart Starr, Brett Favre, Aaron Rodgers. I mean, which quarterback has been more impactful for that Packers franchise? I know it's a tough question, but yeah, which are one of those three?
Rodgers. Starr basically was one of those guys who had the unique ability to splice together the pieces. They had Taylor and they had Horning and a great defense. Of course, you had Vince Lombardi. He was a guy who was a perma-press quarterback, wrinkle-free. I mean, I think he had like one interception in his entire career in the playoffs in 10 games. I mean, that was Bart Starr.
Yeah.
He did what had to be done. And of course, he had no ego. I mean, it was never important to him that he got the credit.
Yes.
Okay, now you got Favre, and Favre made a career of getting close to championships and then throwing them away because he'd be too. He was basically called what they call him, a gunslinger.
Yeah,
there were a lot of turnovers that were avoidable. I can remember games where that last turnover cost the Packers one more step in the playoffs.
Yeah,
Rodgers, I think, is more valuable to the Packers than any single player in the NFL is to their team, because I don't think the Packers go anywhere without Rodgers.
Wow. And talk about that greatness of Aaron Rodgers, even though he's fallen short. You know, him and Favre, only one title between them. And Rodgers hasn't been back to the Super Bowl since the 2010 season. That's like, well, it's now, do you still see him as a top 5 quarterback in the history of the game? You know, even though he hasn't been able to make it back to the Super Bowl, which is very shocking.
I would say that, let me put it this way. Aaron Rodgers is the greatest quarterback I've ever seen in his prime years in my life. I don't think anybody is as good as he was in his prime. He's still kind of in his prime years. If you go back a couple of years, but even this year, right, 48 touchdowns and 4 interceptions, and clearly an outstanding team. There's no getting around that. But they had holes. 48-4. I mean, and if he did that 1 year on Nabaté, I can understand that. But you go back to his history, and there's a bunch of years like that. And I've never seen any quarterback come close to that. I mean, great as Joe Montana was in championship games, and of course, as great as Tom Brady is, this guy not only is a winner, but this guy has those stats that are like a standard deviation out ahead of other people.
Wow. And that's something how he fell to the Packers in that draft, you know, which is so
that is fascinating. Yes.
It's like, and just how he felt in that green room. Like, I would love, if I ever talk with Aaron Rodgers, I want to talk with him on what was on his mind during that time. Did he say throughout the entire draft, like, you know, oh, I'm going to get them, I'm going to get this league, oh, I'm going to get, you know, I wonder what he was thinking.
Well, here's an interesting anecdote on that. Some people think that a little bit of his tension with Mike McCarthy was because McCarthy passed on him when McCarthy was having to do evaluation of quarterbacks, you know, for the San Francisco. I think he was coaching in San Francisco.
That's right. And they had the first pick.
Alex Smith. And Rodgers having played in Northern California, having grown up in Southern California, was, I think, had everything short of his jock strap on, you know, ready to go to the 49ers, and he gets passed over. And there are some people who feel that there was that, and you know, Rodgers is such a passive aggressive guy. I mean, everything's like a chip on his shoulders. He doesn't tell you what's going on. And some people feel that's part of what it was all about, was he felt that he got jobbed out by McCarthy, and that he was never able to connect with McCarthy after that. It may be just one of those urban legend ideas, but it makes some degree of sense. But you're right. And oh, by the way, Nabaté, you probably know this. A lot of fans don't. Dan Marino was the 6th pick among quarterbacks in 1983. Five other quarterbacks got picked ahead of him. Now, one of them was Jim Kelly. One of them was John Elway. But there were people like Blackledge and
Tony Eason. Yep. And Kenny O'Brien. Kenny O'Brien. Yep.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's they act, when you listen to these guys talk on TV, I always laugh when I see guys like Mel Kiper and these guys. They're good at what they do. I don't mean to say they aren't, but they act as if they're in some laboratory, some scientific laboratory, and they have the answer. These guys are guessing, man. They're all guessing, because you find out after a few years how far off they are in some of these picks.
That's right. That's right. And it's so funny. But I do give Mel Kiper props. I'll never forget. It was one of the first drafts I really watched. It was that 89 draft, I think, when Jeff George was the number one pick. Or 90, it was one of those years. But when Mel Kiper, it wasn't 89, it was 90, I think, when Jeff George was number one. But Mel Kiper was going off saying, I didn't have Jeff George in my top 60. I didn't have that. So, and then I said, I give him that. But then he was off with Russell Wilson when John Gruden almost put him in a headlock because John Gruden knew Russell Wilson was going to be that guy. He knew it, and Mel Kiper was saying he was going to be a backup. Pretty much. So yeah, like you said, it's like they're throwing darts.
Yeah, the point is that these people are doing this for a living, and doing it for a living, and they still have so many misses.
Yeah, right.
So many whiffs. It makes it fascinating, and that makes the draft interesting, of course, because you watch and you still have no outcome until you see these guys play.
Yes, and speaking of those misses, I remember talking with Rochelle, talking with her a month ago. So we were talking about the Bears and talking about misses, how the Chicago Bears traded up to draft Mitchell Trubisky in the 2017 draft, and behind Patrick Mahomes ended up going to number 10 and Deshaun Watson number 12, and second pick was Trubisky. And what whoa, like I'm sorry, I'm speechless, sir. What was your take on that draft when that happened, when they traded up for Trubisky?
If you look at that situation, well, first of all, which of the three guys is white? Trubisky.
Okay, and has a Polish name too.
There are a lot of well-meaning white and black people who have real racial issues that they don't even understand. So I don't suggest that for a minute anybody deliberately was racist. But I am going to say that what if the role was reversed? What if Mahomes and Watson were white and Trubisky were black? Would you got, okay? So you got that element in there. But more than that, the thing that really knocked me for a loop was Trubisky only played 1 year in college.
That's right. In North Carolina.
You got a sample of like 10 games for this guy, and he didn't play on a national championship team. So anybody says, well, Mahomes was, I think, with Texas Tech, and Watson wasn't he Louisville or something like that?
Clemson, and had a historic career and won the title his last year. Yeah, against Alabama.
So you have one guy who played at Texas Tech, a situation like Trubisky. The other guy played in Clemson, and neither one of them get picked ahead of him. I that's so hard. The thing that bothers me is the innocent person here is Trubisky. He never asked to be picked second, and he's played hard. He's been a good soldier. I root like heck that he'll have a good career, but I agree with you. I cannot understand that pick.
It's just amazing. And Deshaun Watson, probably the greatest. I would say the greatest quarterback career I've seen in my lifetime. And I've been watching college football since like the mid 80s, which, still not many years, but Watson was just so decorated, so decorated. So this is unreal. And sir, do you think the Bears will get Russell Wilson? Because he did list the Bears as one of his teams. If they wanted to trade him, could the Bears be able to pony up enough for Russell Wilson?
The Bears do not have a history for paying a lot of money for anything. You know that.
That's true. That's
true.
I
mean, go back to the coaches. I remember Mike Holmgren left Green Bay. They might have been able to get him. Before he went to Seattle.
Yeah.
But they're going to pay a retail price for Mike Holmgren. The Bears have a history of hiring guys who either were never coaches before or guys who had moderate success elsewhere. They don't have to pay the big bucks for coach. But I'll tell you, if they are willing to loosen up the checkbook, that would absolutely electrify that city to get Russell Wilson.
That's for sure, because they put that money into Jay Cutler. So, they need to do that. And also, Matt Nagy should be doing that to look to save, and Ryan Pace to look to save their jobs. For sure.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing that he would list the Bears. Because you got a cold weather town.
Yeah.
And you got I can only guess that Russell is a very bright young man, knows that city is on fire for the Bears. And that fire would blow open like a fireplace if he would show up. That he'd have passion behind him there.
And it's so funny. I've talked to people that said, why does he list the Cowboys or Raiders? I'm like, because those are two of the most historic franchises. And
Of
if
course.
he comes in and wins a title with the Raiders or the Cowboys, come on now. Like he would be cemented as one of the greats of all time, for sure. Like those franchises are, and especially Las Vegas too. Oh, right, Dr. Claerbaut? Like that.
I'm surprised that there was apparently a falling out with him and Carroll, because boy, in the early part of his career, they looked like they were joined at the hip, Carroll
Mm-hmm.
and Wilson.
That's right. That's right. And he believed in Russell. Like they had the free agent Matt Flynn was supposed to be the quarterback, and then Carroll straight up said, "Listen, Russell's just outplaying him in practice." I mean, Carroll gave him the keys, early for sure.
Yes, he did. And I remember, I know how often there would be a big fourth down, and you'd see Carroll call timeout, and you could tell he's basically asking Russell if he thinks he can get that first down.
Yeah.
When McCarthy we had Aaron Rodgers, he would just send a punting unit or the field goal unit in. I mean, that happened in some very big games. So I had this feeling that those guys were an unbreakable bond, but something happened somewhere that broke down the trust, because they wouldn't be talking trade unless there's some issues that have developed between Carroll and Russell and that we don't know about.
Yeah, that's true. And Russell will keep it close to the hip, that definitely for
Yep.
sure. So, but what a fascinating individual, definitely. And wow, and you're a fascinating individual, sir. And I thank you so much for the honor to speak with you and talk about the history of sports and talk about society and education and mix everything up with you. Wow, such an honor to speak with you. I'm so glad that Rochelle was able to introduce us. I'm so glad to know Rochelle and to meet you, sir. Thank you for being on So Much to Talk About.
It was a joy to be with you, Nabaté, and I'd be happy to talk to you anytime. You've got a wonderful show, and you ask all the right questions, and you know your sports. So those listeners out there better pay attention.
Oh, it's an honor for you to say that. I feel like ordained, Absolutely.
I have a little anointing oil here, but since we're not in the same studio, I have to kind of keep it to myself here. God
Wow.
bless, man. Keep going.
Thank you, sir. And thank you all for watching So Much to Talk About. Have a wonderful evening. God bless. Take care. Bye-bye.